The corridor camera showed a frozen frame. No signal loss, no static, just a clean cut, 6 seconds long. I stopped beneath the lens and checked my watch. The patrol log showed no maintenance window. A child's slipper rested against the wall, placed neatly, as if forgotten mid-step. The hallway was silent. Protocol demanded I move on. Instinct told me not to. The guard stood beneath the ceiling-mounted camera long enough for the quiet to become noticeable, the soft hum of ventilation flattening into something oppressive, and he replayed the timestamp in his head without moving his eyes from the lens. 6 seconds absent from a system designed to fail loudly if touched. His breath steady, gloved hands resting near his belt, as if posture alone could restore order. The service corridor was narrow, designed for staff movement, not observation, with pale stone walls that held the day's cold, and a floor polished to a dull sheen by decades of careful maintenance, and it connected the residential wing to a logistics passage most personnel rarely used. He checked the patrol schedule again, not from habit but from process, confirming the princess had been moved through this section 20 minutes earlier under standard escort, her route adjusted that morning due to a minor event in the main gallery. The camera interruption aligned too neatly with that window to dismiss. He crouched and examined the small slipper placed against the wall, child-sized, clean, deliberately set rather than dropped, and noted the absence of scuff marks or drag lines nearby, suggesting someone had paused here, not hurried. His earpiece crackled once with routine chatter from another post, but nothing addressed him directly, and he did not respond. He rose, scanning the corridor ends, noting that the service door at the far end sat closed but not sealed, its magnetic lock indicator showing idle rather than engaged. That alone did not constitute a breach, but combined with the camera cut, it formed a shape his training recognized, even if protocol had no single line for it. He keyed into the local access panel and pulled the camera's diagnostics, finding no error codes, no reset flags, no maintenance authorization. The interruption logged as an external pause with a manual resume, something only possible with administrative access or a hard override. The air felt cooler here than in the main hall, and he registered the faint smell of cleaning solvent layered beneath something warmer, human, recent. He straightened, adjusted his stance to appear casual to anyone watching, and made a silent decision to continue the patrol at half speed instead of moving on as the route demanded, counting steps as he advanced, listening for anything that didn't belong, knowing that if this was nothing, he would file a minor irregularity report and absorb the quiet correction later. But if it was something, even small, the next moments would determine whether he remained an observer or became part of the record. He reached the junction where the service corridor met the inner access passage and paused again, this time deliberately under the pretense of checking a wall-mounted panel, his peripheral vision catching a slight disturbance in the air as a door further down settled into its frame, the soft click of metal meeting metal delayed just enough to suggest recent use. He logged the location marker mentally and turned back toward the camera point, forcing himself to retrace his steps so the movement would appear routine on any live feed, though he knew the recorded gap would already raise questions if reviewed. At the terminal near the maintenance alcove, he accessed the corridor's access history, scrolling through entries that were normally dense with authorized staff IDs and service codes, and found the anomaly immediately. A single badge activation without classification, the ID string truncated, the clearance field blank, time-stamped to the exact second the camera feed resumed. He did not react outwardly, but his jaw set,
and he saved the log locally before the system could auto-sync, a permitted action that nevertheless narrowed his margin for explanation. Footsteps approached from the inner passage, measured and unhurried, and he stepped aside as an unfamiliar man emerged, dressed in neutral staff attire without insignia, posture relaxed, eyes forward, carrying nothing that would justify his presence there. The man's badge was visible but angled away, and he nodded once in acknowledgement, a gesture practiced enough to discourage scrutiny. The guard returned the nod after a fraction of a second longer than courtesy required, long enough to register the man's calm and the absence of the subtle tension most unauthorized individuals carried even when confident. The man continued on, disappearing toward the logistics passage, and the guard waited until the sound of his steps faded before resuming his position, his pulse steady but attention sharpened. He replayed the escort movement in his mind, the princess's small hand resting in her attendant's grasp, the way children sometimes slowed near intersections, distracted by echoes or light, and he felt the weight of the corridor press in as the pieces aligned without yet forming a chargeable conclusion. He transmitted a low-priority inquiry to central monitoring, requesting confirmation of scheduled maintenance access in the residential wing, phrasing it neutrally, and received a delayed acknowledgement rather than an answer. The delay mattered. He returned to the slipper, lifted it carefully with gloved fingers, and noted the warmth still held in the fabric, recent enough to narrow the window further, and he placed it back exactly as he found it, aware that moving it at all might later be questioned. When Central finally responded, the message was brief and incomplete, stating no maintenance was logged for that corridor during the period in question, followed by a suggestion to continue patrol and file standard notes. He acknowledged receipt without comment, but he did not move, choosing instead to stand at the junction where all paths converged, posture neutral, eyes alert, understanding that the interval had already passed, but the consequences had not, and that whatever had slipped through those 6 seconds was still within the palace, unseen, but not beyond reach. The guard remained at the junction longer than patrol doctrine preferred, long enough for the corridor to cool again and the quiet to settle into something watchful. And when he finally moved, it was not toward the route ahead, but back toward the monitoring terminal he had left idle, his steps controlled, neither hurried nor hesitant. He accessed the access control system with a deeper query level, one that required justification if audited, and filtered badge activity by physical route rather than by personnel name, a slower method, but one that exposed patterns instead of labels. The same truncated identifier appeared again, not once, but twice, both within restricted zones, both tagged as pass-through rather than entry or exit, a subtle misuse that allowed movement without triggering presence alerts. He noted the spacing between activations, the rhythm too deliberate to be accidental, and pulled the corresponding camera feeds from adjacent corridors, finding nothing overtly wrong until he slowed the playback frame by frame and noticed the same figure at the edge of view more than once, never centered, always just outside primary focus, moving with the assurance of someone who knew where not to look. The guard felt pressure then, not fear, but the awareness that this was no longer a technical irregularity, but a human one, shaped by intention, and he closed the query before it could flag itself as excessive. A message came through his earpiece from a supervisory channel, polite, neutral, asking for a status update on his position, and he responded with the minimum required, confirming location and patrol continuity without mentioning the access anomaly. As he spoke, he watched the inner passage and saw the unfamiliar man again at a distance, now stationary, engaged in quiet conversation with a senior attendant whose authority badge he recognized immediately, the attendant's posture deferential despite their equivalent rank, the exchange brief and contained. The guard did not hear the words, but he saw the attendant gesture toward the residential wing, and something in that motion tightened his focus because it implied permission being granted after the fact rather than before. When the two separated, the man adjusted his jacket, straightened his badge just enough to appear legitimate, and began moving back toward the restricted corridor leading closer to the private residence, his pace unchanged, his expression unreadable. The guard reported a routine timing adjustment to Central, requesting temporary coverage of his forward sector, and received authorization without delay, which confirmed that attention elsewhere was thin. He stepped into the man's path under the guise of corridor control, raised a hand calmly, and asked for identification in the exact tone used 100 times before, not accusatory, not apologetic, simply procedural, and the man stopped, met his gaze evenly, and presented the badge without protest, as if he had been expecting this moment and had prepared for it. The badge scanned as valid at first glance, the system emitting its familiar confirmation tone, but the guard watched the secondary data scroll rather than the green indicator, noting the absence of department linkage and the delayed authentication response, a lag small enough to escape casual notice but not his, and he handed it back without comment, maintaining the outward flow of normalcy while logging the irregularity mentally. The man thanked him in a low voice and moved past, and the guard allowed it, understanding that stopping him now without explicit cause would escalate matters prematurely and potentially close access he still needed open. Instead, he followed at a distance that suggested coincidence rather than pursuit, adjusting his pace to match ambient movement, and watched as the man entered the restricted wing using the same pass-through method, the door opening smoothly, silently, and sealing behind him. The guard diverted to a side panel and accessed the escort schedule for the princess, confirming she was currently in a private sitting room under light supervision, a routine arrangement deemed low risk due to internal location, and he felt the pressure increase, not because of certainty, but because of proximity. A senior officer's voice came through his earpiece then, controlled, but firmer than before, instructing him to resume standard patrol and leave access verification to internal affairs, citing insufficient evidence for intervention, and he acknowledged the order as required, his response clipped, professional. He resumed movement along the approved route, but adjusted his path subtly to bring him closer to the sitting room corridor, positioning himself where he could observe without appearing to guard, and he noted the temperature change as he entered the residential zone, warmer, quieter, designed to soften vigilance. From down the hall, he saw the unfamiliar man standing outside the sitting room entrance, speaking quietly with the child's attendant, his body angled to block the doorway just enough to limit visibility inside, and the attendant's posture suggested uncertainty rather than alarm. The guard slowed, every step measured, and watched the attendant glance down the corridor toward him before returning attention to the man, a flicker of relief crossing her face too quickly to be deliberate. The guard did not draw his weapon or raise his voice. He simply stopped within sightline, positioned himself squarely in the corridor, and waited, creating a presence that required acknowledgement without demanding it. The man noticed him almost immediately and adjusted his stance, the calm still there, but now edged with calculation, and the attendant stepped aside, revealing the open door behind her, and, just within, the princess seated on the floor, absorbed in something small and ordinary, unaware of the adult's tension. The guard felt the pressure settle into place then, not as a dramatic choice, but as a narrowing of options, understanding that whatever authority had enabled this man's presence was now pressing against his responsibility, and that the next word spoken or withheld would determine whether protocol remained intact or yielded to something older and harder to justify after the fact. The guard held his position without moving closer, aware that distance itself was a form of control, and the corridor seemed to narrow as attention converged on the quiet standoff forming without announcement. The senior officer's earlier instruction echoed in his awareness, not as words but as weight, and he knew that any deviation now would be logged, reviewed, interpreted by people far from this hallway. He addressed the attendant first, asking a routine question about the schedule in a tone that assumed nothing was wrong, and she answered with visible care, confirming the princess was resting before the next engagement, her voice steady but her hands clasped too tightly. The unfamiliar man interjected smoothly, identifying himself by title rather than name, a role that implied oversight without specifying scope, and stated that his presence had been verbally authorized due to a sensitive internal review. The guard acknowledged the statement without accepting it, asking instead for written confirmation, a request framed as compliance rather than challenge, and the man replied that documentation would follow, a delay explained as necessary discretion. The guard listened, eyes moving briefly to the open doorway where the child remained on the floor, still unaware, and then back to the man, noting how his body remained angled to shield the interior. Central Command contacted him again, this time directly, instructing him to disengage and clear the corridor to avoid alarming the resident, the phrasing careful, emphasizing stability and chain of command rather than safety. He responded with a confirmation that he was maintaining a neutral posture and requested clarification on whether the man's clearance extended to unsupervised proximity, a question that forced specificity without accusation. The reply did not answer directly, instead reiterating that no breach had been confirmed and that escalation would require evidence, and he felt the narrowing again, the space between instruction and instinct closing. He shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself so the doorway was no longer blocked solely by the man, a subtle adjustment that brought the child into his line of sight more fully, and he asked the attendant to step back and retrieve a routine item from inside, something innocuous that nevertheless required her to pass him, creating separation. She hesitated, looked once at the man, then complied, moving past the guard with a murmur of acknowledgement, and the man's expression tightened just enough to register. The guard did not touch him or issue a command. He simply remained, occupying the corridor with a presence that could not be ignored, and he understood that this was the point at which his role shifted from observer to obstacle, a shift that would carry consequences regardless of outcome. The senior officer's voice returned, sharper now, instructing the guard to step aside immediately, citing disruption of authorized activity and potential distress to the child, and he acknowledged receipt even as he remained where he was, his stillness itself a form of reply. He asked calmly whether the man's authorization included physical contact or directive authority over the princess, and the pause before the answer stretched longer than protocol allowed, filled only by the soft ambient sounds of the residential wing. The man spoke again, asserting that the line of questioning was inappropriate and that the guard was exceeding his remit, his tone controlled but edged, and the guard noted how he avoided restating the specifics of his clearance. He did not argue. Instead, he requested that the interaction pause until written authorization was produced or a senior presence arrived in person, framing it as a temporary measure to preserve clarity. The attendant returned then, standing just inside the doorway with the requested item, and the princess looked up briefly, her attention drawn by the adult's stillness rather than any raised voice, her voice steady, but her hands clasped too tightly. The guard met her gaze for a moment and then looked away, deliberately, keeping his focus on procedure rather than emotion, and he gestured for the attendant to close the door partially, reducing exposure without isolating the child. Central Command hesitated again, the delay speaking louder than any reprimand, and finally instructed him to hold position pending review, the phrasing a compromise that acknowledged uncertainty without conceding error. The man exhaled slowly, the first visible sign of strain, and stepped back half a pace, no longer blocking the corridor fully, and the guard recognized the shift as incremental but significant. He logged the interaction verbally, concise and factual, ensuring the record would reflect actions rather than interpretations, and he remained in place until additional personnel arrived to assume formal oversight. When they did, the corridor filled with quiet movement and restrained authority, and the man was escorted away without spectacle, his calm intact, but his access contained. The guard did not watch him go. Instead, he maintained his post until the door to the sitting room closed fully, and the attendant confirmed the child was settled and unharmed. Only then did he step back, posture unchanged, aware that questions would follow and explanations would be weighed against protocol, but also aware that the hallway was no longer frozen by uncertainty, and that the interval, missed or not, had been answered in the only way it could without rewriting the rules entirely.
The corridor did not return to normal when the additional personnel arrived. It changed texture instead, filling with the quiet discipline of bodies placed deliberately, boots aligned with seams in the floor, radios muted to vibration, and the guard felt the shift as a tightening rather than relief, because resolution in this place rarely arrived cleanly. He remained where he had been instructed to hold, just far enough from the sitting room door to respect privacy, but close enough to register movement, and he watched as authority reassembled itself around the disruption, careful not to name it as such. A senior supervisor took position opposite him, posture neutral, eyes briefly scanning the corridor before settling on the guard with professional familiarity, and asked for a concise account, not inviting interpretation, only sequence. The guard delivered it evenly, beginning with the camera interruption, moving through the access anomaly, the unlisted badge, the proximity to the child, each detail placed in order without emphasis, and he stopped when finished, allowing the silence to confirm completeness. The supervisor acknowledged with a slight nod and turned attention to the administrative staff now clustered near the junction, their presence understated but decisive, and requests for verification moved quietly up the chain, voices low, faces controlled. The guard noticed how no one asked the attendant to repeat herself. Her statement had already been taken and accepted, a small but telling indicator that the situation had crossed from inconvenience into record. The sitting room door remained closed, a deliberate boundary, and the guard stood with his back to it, becoming a physical buffer without being asked, aware of how that placement would read later if scrutinized. He felt the weight of observation then, not from cameras or supervisors, but from the institutional gaze that would later parse his choices against doctrine, and he adjusted his stance to remove any trace of defiance, aligning himself fully with containment rather than confrontation. A message arrived through his earpiece requesting that he prepare a written supplemental report once relieved, and he acknowledged, understanding that this was not punitive but procedural, the first step in a process that would decide whether his actions were classified as necessary discretion or unauthorized interference.
The supervisor informed him quietly that movement in the residential wing was suspended until further notice, the princess's schedule adjusted without explanation, and the guard registered that as confirmation rather than consequence. Time stretched, measured not in minutes but in the absence of further escalation, and the corridor held its breath, the earlier tension diffusing into a controlled stillness that signaled containment had been achieved but not yet explained. Relief came without ceremony, another guard stepping into his position with a brief exchange of acknowledgments that conveyed continuity rather than replacement, and he withdrew a measured distance, remaining within the zone but no longer its focal point. He completed the supplemental report at a standing terminal nearby, his words precise, stripped of inference, each sentence anchored to observable fact, and he felt the discipline of that restraint as a form of quiet defense, protecting not only himself but the integrity of the response. When finished, he transmitted it through the secure channel and waited, hands resting lightly on the edge of the console, eyes forward, posture unchanged, while authority moved in slower, broader arcs beyond him. The supervisor returned once more, informed him that the matter would be reviewed internally, and instructed him to resume standard duties pending further contact, the tone neither approving nor critical, and he accepted the directive without comment. As he moved away from the corridor, he passed the sitting room once more and heard the faint, ordinary sound of a child's voice inside, calm, untroubled, and he did not slow, understanding that protection was most effective when it left no imprint on the protected. The palace resumed its rhythms gradually, foot traffic returning in controlled intervals, schedules reasserted with minor adjustments that would appear logistical to anyone not looking closely, and the guard merged back into that flow, another uniform among many, his earlier stillness dissolving into motion. Yet he carried the interval with him, the 6 seconds unaccounted for now documented, contextualized, contained, and he knew that while the system would process it according to its rules, the true measure lay in what had not occurred. No announcement followed, no correction issued publicly, no commendation offered privately, only the quiet knowledge that a line had been held without being declared, and that the child at the center of it would remember nothing more than a delayed schedule and an ordinary afternoon. As his shift continued, the guard returned to routine checks, his attention steady, his manner unchanged, but with an added clarity that would inform future pauses, future moments when something small did not align. The hallway where it had begun no longer felt frozen when he passed it later, just another corridor among many, and that, he understood, was the intended outcome, a resolution that left no mark except in the records and in the disciplined awareness of those whose role was to notice when silence meant more than nothing was happening.